Hey developers, so today we're doing something really fun. I have Sam from Byte by Byte here on the channel. I'm going to ask him all the tips and tricks you need to know to land that job at Facebook, Google, how to pass that algorithm interview, and all those deep questions that you want to hear about. And also, he actually interviewed me, so I gave him tips on how you can pass a front-end interview. So make sure you click on the description. You can watch his video with me first, and then you can watch this video next. So this is pretty fun. I know there's a lot of controversy with algorithm interviews. A lot of people are against them. Some people are for them. If you have no idea what algorithm interviews are, this is also a great place to start because we describe, what to expect when you're trying to interview for Facebook or Google or any of these companies that kind of use these kind of tricky type questions that make you go on a whiteboard and answer. So yeah, stay all the way to the end. This is a really interesting interview. And also make sure you click in the description and check out his channel and him interviewing me about front-end interview tips. So let's begin. Hey, Sam. So thank you so much for being here. Algorithm interviews is so interesting because, I've gone through them. They're quite difficult. But a lot of companies, this is the rubric that you need to have. This is what you need to pass to be able to get in. So I just kind of want to start off and ask you, what is your thoughts on algorithms in general?
Questions. Yeah, for sure. I think that, this is definitely one of those things that, as you said, maybe a little bit less so for front-end interviews specifically, but for a lot of these general roles, and especially at FANG type companies or, bigger tech companies, it's just one of those things that's such a integral part of the process. And I think I know I hear a lot of people don't love algorithmic interviews because they're really hard for one. And also it doesn't necessarily feel like it's that similar to what you're actually doing in the job. But it's one of those things that if you really want to get a job at one of those companies right now, that's kind of the way it is. And so, what I really try and help people with is how do we get good at this? We know we have to do it. So rather than worry about oh, this isn't fun or I don't want to do this, let's figure out how we can actually get good at these interviews so that, we can really convince them that we are a good candidate for that role.
I like kind of that attitude going in, being instead of having this feeling gosh, why are they asking this? And having those negative thoughts of, well, I'm never going to use this on the job. But kind of going in at a different aspect to be well, this is what they're asking us to do. I mean, most of these places that have these type of interviews give you a pretty big heads up. A lot of them even give you weeks to prepare.
And they'll give you lists of problems and they'll give you lists of topics to study. So they're not hiding it by any means.
Right. So if you ever go into an interview and all of a sudden they're by the way, here you have to reverse a linked list on the whiteboard, that should never happen. They should have at least given you some sort of heads up hey, you should probably study these algorithms before you come in. That's
I think also one of the things that I see from people a lot is people will sort of not know what to expect in their interview and not realize that you have a recruiter who you can reach out to and actually ask what should I expect in this interview. You really shouldn't ever be going into your interview and not having an idea of what to expect, because yes, the recruiter's non-technical. Yes, they're not going to say oh, you need to know graph problems or you need to know linked list necessarily, unless the company has a interview prep document on that they're quoting. But they can still tell you hey, you're going to need to do coding interviews, or you're going to need to do system design, or you're going to need to do behavioral interviews or leadership or whatever else. And so you should use that resource and actually ask them what to expect, because remember, they also get compensated when you get hired. So, it's in their best interest to help you out as much as they're allowed to.
Yeah, it's funny. I think when you get approached by a recruiter and you start that process with a job, people get nervous. It's well, should I email them? Should I not email them? Should I ask them questions? But I think you should always, to your point, just be open with them, explain where you're at, ask questions. Obviously, they can't give you the answers, but they'll definitely want to guide you. And that's a good point. You're saying a lot of times there's some sort of compensation that's connected to these recruiters in some way, in some shape or form, to get you in, because they want you to succeed too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there was a great quote, I think from George Clooney, and I'm totally going to butcher this now, but it was something like he was talking about when he started getting acting gigs. And what he said was that he changed his attitude from thinking like that I want them to like me when going into an audition to I am the answer to their problems. Because there's in that case, a talent scout, in our case, a recruiter who they need someone to fill a role. Like they're not hiring just like to help you out. They're hiring because they actually need someone to do a job, and that they need someone to do a job so much that they're willing to spend $100,000 a year, $150,000 a year to get someone to do that job. So it's not like, it's not something where you need to think about it as like, I'm under them or they basically have all the power. Like, yes, they do have power in certain elements, but you're helping them as much as they are helping you. So, you should treat it as I encourage people to treat it almost as a more collaborative process, because really all you're doing in the interview and all you're doing through this whole process is trying to show them that, you are actually the person that they're looking for. Because if you are, that's great. They can stop hiring. That's exactly what they want. They want for you to prove to them that you're the right person. But on the flip side, it's a really bad thing if they hire the person who's not a good fit. And so they are taking you like kind of through the ringer to make sure that you actually are the person that you say you are, and that you do have the skills and that you are the right fit for their company.
I like that idea of thinking of it as a collaborative between you and them. It's definitely like, I think some newer developers and some, I don't know if this is generational thing, but they don't, like, employers don't owe you anything. Like basically, I mean, obviously you need to be a right fit for them, and vice versa. It has to be a kind of a match on both sides, but you do realize like they do have the leverage. And a lot of these tech companies, I want to say I've heard, like, especially the ones who are doing algorithms, and there's this acronym called FANG, which is like Facebook and Amazon and Google, and where like they get thousands and thousands of resumes, I'm assuming. I think that's what I've heard is pretty accurate. So you are competing against a lot of people, and you have to really stand out. Now, the leverage, I think, does change at some point once you go through a lot of the ringer, once you go through their maybe multiple phone, like one or two phone interviews, and then you do like an on-site, or nowadays they're doing virtual on-sites. And you finally get to that point where maybe you're closer to the offer, and then you can there is some tactics and some things you can do that could benefit you, and you have a little bit more leverage, because I think at that point, especially if they're ready to give you an offer, you can do counters, you can play off one company versus another, although I know that doesn't always work. And I think, in fact, I know you have a whole program that teaches people a lot of these things. I want to get back to that in a second, but what kind of questions, like let's kind of roll it back to the initial phone screening. Maybe you're doing a first algorithm type interview. Like, what kind of questions should you expect?
Yeah, I think that fundamentally with most of these interviews, we're expecting these sort of classic data structures and algorithms type interview questions. So like, this is the sort of thing that you would be doing on LeetCode, the sort of thing that you would be doing on like HackerRank, something like that. And generally speaking, like when you're going into your interviews, there is a degree to which there's kind of a spectrum as you go through the process. So like I would generally expect, I hate to say this, but everyone always asks me, so I will. Expect the phone screens to be a little bit easier than the on-site interviews. That's not a hard and fast rule by any means, because it's so dependent on the individual interviewer. But generally speaking, you're going to see mostly those algorithmic interviews in that first round, in that phone interview. And then as you move into the on-site interviews, or, now we're doing a lot of virtual on-site interviews, you're going to see more of a mix. So depending on whether you're more experienced or more, earlier in your career, if you're earlier in your career, you're going to see mostly those sort of algorithmic problems, mostly maybe some behavioral problems, where the questions where they're asking you about like your past experiences, how you work on a team, all those sorts of things. But then as you're getting more senior, that's where you have to look out for system design and more leadership type interviews as well. Because if you think about it, as your responsibilities shift, as you become more senior, you're expected to do more of the like designing of the systems. You're expected to be maybe leading a team or at least supporting the leadership in some more meaningful way. So those interviews do tend to shift somewhat to reflect that. But everyone should be expecting to do those algorithmic interviews, because I've worked with people who are looking for like, you know, middle management positions at like Uber, and were still expected to do algorithmic interviews, even though they hadn't programmed in the past 5, maybe 10 years. So it is something that, as long as you're doing engineering related stuff, you should expect to see those algorithmic problems.
Yeah, that's crazy that, I usually, a lot of these organizations are, everyone has to go through the same kind of gauntlet where you have to know these algorithm interviews. I have seen a couple of these companies where they give the algorithm type questions to a lot of their technical managers, to definitely all their software engineers, but sometimes like the design guys, I don't know if this is common. I feel like some of them times they get like a modified one, or it's more like, I've seen some companies where they give take-home tests to their more, the more design, accessibility, like type people, and they kind of skip the algorithm route, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think that it, you know, when we're talking about the algorithmic things, we're really looking at like primarily, honestly, like I feel like most of the roles that I see people applying for these days are essentially full stack roles. Like you have a lot less relatively at these bigger tech companies. They're more looking for that full stack with maybe a, you know, specialization in front end or back end. But it's with those sorts of roles that you can really expect the algorithmic interviews. I think the more you specialize, like if you're really going into more, say like mobile development or like strict front end development or any of these different things, that's where you do see more of a shift away, because it's more about when you're defining clearly, like this is my skill set, they can do more to test you on that specific skill set, rather than if you're looking for a more full stack role, then they're testing you in some like general way, like what is your knowledge, what is your experience. But one thing that people can do that I would highly recommend is, when you are interviewing, one, as we already talked about, ask your recruiter what to expect. But two, you can also go on glassdoor.com and look at interview questions that people have been asked at that company for that role in the past. So especially for bigger companies where they have, you know, a company like Google or Facebook, they might have 5,000 people have put their interview experience, and you can filter down and see, okay, well, for this front end role, these are examples of what the people got asked. And don't expect that to be the exact question, but it gives you that sort of framework in terms of what to expect, what type of thing they're going to be asking you.
Do you think, I think one criticism we hear about these algorithm interviews is that it does really help if you have that knowledge. Obviously, if you come from like a computer science background, I mean, you've worked with a lot of people. Have you seen a difference from people who have computer science backgrounds versus who don't, who go to these algorithm interviews? Or is it just depending on how much work you put in? I mean, what would you think?
So I think that the thing that people tend to be missing if they don't have the computer science background is that they don't have the same degree of like having studied data structures and algorithms. So when you go through a boot camp, for example, like I have several friends who went through App Academy, both of whom are working now as software engineers. Obviously, going through a boot camp is a totally valid way to make your way into software engineering. However, they focus almost 100% on the practical elements of it. And so like, if you get into your interview and they ask you a question that involves using heaps and you don't know what a heap is, or you don't know how to use a heap, then you know, you're basically screwed before you even start. And so that's where having that background can be a really beneficial thing. That being said, of course, like you can learn those things without having a CS degree. And so I think the main thing that I would encourage people to do is, if you don't have a CS degree or you don't have that background in the data structures and algorithms, make sure to like give them adequate time to actually learn those and make sure that you have that foundation. Because even if I tell you like, hey, go find a brute force solution to this problem, if you don't know how the data structure works, or you don't know, you know, how to use it in whatever capacity, then even something that should be fairly simple can become very difficult because you just are like starting from absolute scratch rather than being able to, you know, stand on the shoulders of giants who actually created all this stuff.
Yeah, I kind of feel like that. Even I got a CS degree about, 10 years ago. And I feel like it was still like I've gone through those interviews in the past. And I still think it's like really, even with that background, it was still really difficult for me to go through those interviews just because I can't remember.
Yeah.
Like when I started studying algorithms again, I'm like, I remember creating like a linked list from scratch. And I remember creating a binary search tree and doing in order and pre-order and traversals, but I cannot remember how to do it off the top of my head because I literally haven't done it in 10 years. So even for someone with a CS background, unless you just graduated a few months ago, you're going to probably need to spend quite a bit of time. And that's kind of one thing that I've learned going through these type of interviews, is that it does require practice and it does require time. And to the point we made earlier about the talking to your recruiter and then telling them, you know, you need some time. A lot of times they give you a few weeks sometimes to prepare, and you can even give that extended if you need it. So just taking that time and going through and learning. And I really like, I've gone through some of your program just for fun. And I noticed like one thing you really stress is don't try like the cram method. So there's this whole idea of creating habits and how people learn. And I think that's a really important part when you're trying to learn these algorithms, is that some people think that like, I just need to spend 10 hours on a Saturday or a Sunday before my interview on Monday and just cram all day, kind of like we're back in college or something. And that'll be enough to pass our algorithm test on Monday. But you really are not going to retain all that information in that 10 hours. And what I found that with these algorithm interviews is you really need to understand the problem in such a way that you can like literally walk through your code one by one without a compiler and write usually on a piece of paper or whiteboard and be able to go through each input and understand it. Otherwise you just won't pass.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely critical. And I think that, you know, I would say two things, you know, in our program that we really sort of stress with when you're thinking about how to prepare for your interviews. So the two things are, one, you need to understand the frameworks and not just the specific tactics. And two, you need to develop those consistent habits. Because starting with the frameworks versus the tactics, a lot of times what people do is they try and cram problems and basically like memorize solutions to problems on leak code. And the issue with that is that while problems overlap, what you're essentially doing is you are memorizing an individual tactical, like this is the way to solve each individual problem. And over time, you know, once you do enough of them, you do start to make those mental connections, but it's really inefficient because every time you go into your interview or every time you're practicing a problem, it basically depends on like, have you seen this problem or something similar before? And you essentially end up with this binary where it's like either you have seen it before and you're going to do well in your interview, or you haven't seen it before and you either figure it out on the fly or you're just sunk. You don't have any sort of process. And so what we really focus on in our program, for one, is giving people that step-by-step framework. So it's not about understanding tactically how do I solve one problem. It's understanding how do I have a general framework that applies to lots of different problems, regardless of what I see in my interview. And then the second part, consistency, is so important because that's, you know, you touched on this a minute ago here, where it's like, there's evidence that when you cram stuff, you only recall about 50% of what you were studying like an hour after you stopped studying. It's like, it's really, really bad how much our brain can actually recall. And so the way to do this instead is this idea of spaced repetition, which is basically that we're going to review things on a regular basis and we're going to come back to them every day, and little by little we're reinforcing our skills. So like if you think about, if you studied a language in like grade school, if you haven't spoken it, even if you were really good at it back then, if you haven't spoken it for 20 years, you're not going to be able to use that language very effectively. If If you haven't studied data structures in 10 years since college, you're not going to remember it. You have to have that repetition. And the weaker you are, the less you understand something, the more frequent that repetition needs to be. So we try and really help people like, in our program, we actually like build like a structured curriculum that kind of enforces all of those things. But it's definitely something that everyone wants to think about when they are preparing, is like, how do I build that consistency and that routine to ultimately get me to my goal, rather than just, I'm going to cram on Saturday, I'm going to spend 10 hours studying, and then that's going to be it.
Yeah, I've done things like that where just like a half hour a day, like I'll feel like, oh gosh, today's super busy. You know, I got X, Y, and Z to do. I got all these things, but if I could just do like a half hour consistently at 6:30 at, like, I have kids like after dinner and the kids are playing their games. Like, oh, if I could do the 6:30 for a half hour, I think that's better than either skipping that day or trying to cram everything into like Sunday for 10 hours. But that's kind of how I've done it in the past. And that's kind of what I've seen from your program. That works.
That like 3.5 hours, if you can get in 30 minutes a day, is going to be way more effective than if you spend 8 hours on one day. And I think that's the thing, like you hit the nail on the head there, which is that you just want to start getting into that routine. Because the other thing is, if you can build a habit around this, the thing that we are always trying to rely on willpower to get ourselves to do things, like get myself to go to the gym, get myself to do my interview prep, get myself to brush my teeth in the morning, whatever it is. But if you think about it, like think about things that are habitual, like hopefully for everyone brushing their teeth. It's not something that you have to think about. It's not something that like takes willpower and energy. It just happens, right? And so with that if you can get away from relying on the willpower and instead making it a habitual thing, then that's where, you know, it becomes way, way easier to actually have that long-term success, in addition to the value of just breaking it up and getting that spaced repetition.
Yeah, I think if anything, anybody's listening, watching right now, just what Sam just said, just keep that in mind. I mean, it's really great advice. All right. I just want to kind of finish this up, just asking one more question, kind of a little bit preview of your program, and we'll put a link in the description below too, so anybody can check it out. I know it's a pretty involved. Can you talk a little bit about your program, and also a little bit about the 3 pillars of interviewing, just maybe to wrap it up?
For sure. Yeah, so our program is called 6 Weeks to Interview Ready, which is exactly what it sounds like. We'll help you prepare for your coding interviews over like a 6-week period. And so the way that we really conceptualize this program is that a lot of times there's like so much stuff that you have to, like, that it feels like you have to learn to prepare for your interviews. And what we were finding is that people were just getting totally overwhelmed and not knowing what to focus on. So what we did is we actually reduced everything down, and this is basically 30 to 60 minutes a day, every day for 6 weeks. We're not going to teach you everything. We're not throwing in the kitchen sink. I think Erik can attest that like there's a lot of stuff that we're not covering in the course, because we really wanted to focus on what are the things that are going to get you those best results as fast as possible. And so, as you mentioned as well, we use this concept of the 3 pillars of interviewing to sort of frame everything. And the 3 pillars of interviewing are really the 3 things that you need to focus on when you are preparing for your interviews to get those optimal results. You need to focus on the data structures and algorithms, and we provide a lot of resources for you to review those. And like, if you're in Erik's situation where it's been a long time, then there are, we have workbooks that'll help you to do that. Then the next thing is actually that problem-solving strategy that I mentioned, having a step-by-step framework, having that strategy, and giving, like, actually learning how to apply that. Because I found I was doing a lot of one-on-one coaching, and I would tell people the strategy, and then they wouldn't be able to actually apply the strategy. So we really worked in like the daily exercises that will help you to do that, help you to actually apply the strategy. And then the third thing is building up that self-confidence and building up the confidence to go into your interview and feel like, I know what I'm doing. I know that I will be able to come up with a solution. Because if you don't have the confidence that you can actually do this, you're gonna just like get into this downward spiral of like self-doubt and like self-criticism that prevents lots of people from being successful in their interviews. And so that's kind of the, a very brief overview. If you do want to find out more about it, you can check out we have a free masterclass called the 4 Horsemen of the Whiteboarding Apocalypse, where I talk through some more of these strategies. It's at bytebybyte.com/masterclass.
Cool. And we'll get that linked up in the description below. Thank you again, Sam. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Erik.